In this video, I'm going to show you how to find a beer line leak on a bottoms-up long draw draft beer system. So on our system here, our beer line runs up through the ceiling into our media room where we do shoot promotional videos and stuff like that. We've noticed that on one of the beer lines, in this case the green beer line, we were losing beer from the keg and we can't figure out where it's going because we've inspected at the dispenser end that there, by removing the coupler, that there's no leak at the valve itself, which would be then going into the drain, and you could literally be having a beer go down the drain. The other thing to inspect on a bottoms-up system is the purge valve on an empty keg detector. If it either breaks in the open position or is left in the open position, the empty keg detector can empty an entire keg down the either permanent drain that bleed-off tube is ran to, or to the bucket that's in the keg room, which is the overflow bucket for the empty keg detectors. If it's leaking at the EKD bleed-off, you'll see that bucket fill up. A keg of beer is 15 gallons. So in a situation where you don't know where the beer is going and you can't visually inspect the entire run of the trunk line because it's either going through a ceiling space or in other cases underground in a chase, there's a method to where you can use a CO2 canister and the gauges on the CO2 canister to determine what section of the trunk line the leak is in. So in this case, I've got the CO2 canister here. I got it set at 30 psi. I know what color beer line I'm looking for in the trunk line, and I've picked this spot to work at because it eliminates, the keg cooler here where our long draws ran out of, or in a keg room situation, you can see the exposed beer line before it runs either out of the keg room overhead or where it goes underground. So if the leak was happening in that spot, you would see it had sprung a leak because you'd have beer all over the place. So this is how to inspect the trunk line in sections that's outside of your keg room and between that and your point of dispense. So on our system, I'm looking for the green line. I have shut the line down and I've turned all the CO2 off to it. I've opened the valve on the other end to make sure that there's no pressure in it. And the next step is to slice open your trunk line carefully and finding the corresponding colored line that is leaving the keg room, meaning from in the keg box, I know it's light green, it comes to this point, I'm still looking for light green. So if you have a keg room that has splices within the keg room, meaning from the empty keg detector, the line goes up and is spliced to another different colored line where it goes underground. Sometimes that'll happen if it was either a retrofit job or if the trunk line was ordered too short, you can extend it. What you want to do is you want to eliminate as much of the system that you can visually see and get to and inspect and isolate the specific section you're trying to test. So for me, I'm trying to test to see if the leak is in the ceiling. So I'm going here. The ceiling is just above me here. And on the other side, right where it exits the ceiling, is where I'm going to test because I want to make sure that the leak is not there, or if it is there, then I know that I have to work there. So the idea behind it is to break the trunk line into sections. If it was going underground in a chase, directly where it goes underground, that's where you pressure test the line. And then right where it comes out from underground is where you want to test. Even if it continues to run towards the dispenser, you want to isolate individual sections. And these would be the ones that would be, I guess, the least desirable places to have a leak would be in an underground chase, or the run that is the most difficult to get to, but I like to eliminate that part first if I can, and if not, then I know that that's where my issue is. So in this case, that's what I'm going to proceed with, is isolating the section that goes through the ceiling. The process is very simple. That was a long explanation. You cut open the trunk line very carefully, because if you go too deep, you're going to hit the beer lines, and that can cause a leak in its own right. Inside the trunk line, you see that the beer lines are wrapped in foil here. I'm going to gently slit in one of the valleys between the lines, being very careful. And then I'm going to peel the foil out, find the line in question, and then I'll show you the next step. All right, I've carefully slit the section of trunk line that I wanted to get to place my splicer to get the gas into the line that we're testing. I've done a a fairly long slit so that I can peel back the outer jacket, the foam, and then expose a little bit more of the beer lines, and that's in case the line that you're looking for is on the backhand side. You can't get to it if you're trying to work through just a slit in the front. And in this case, it is indeed on the back side here. So the light green, which is this line right here, is the one that I'm trying to work on. I'm going to carefully get my cutters in here and cut the line, again, making sure that you've turned the gas off to it, the pumps are turned off, that everything's disconnected, and that you relieve the pressure. I know that it's the line I'm looking for. It's the light green line. I'm going to cut the line. And now, from my CO2 canister at the end, I just have a 3/8 splicer connected straight to the regulator here. I'm going to take a screw clamp, put it on the side of the beer line that I'm going to be testing, put the 3/8 splicer in here, and then using the temporary screw clamp here, you can use a Phillips screwdriver if you have that style. I find a nut driver a little bit easier for these. The reason I'm using this is because once we're done, if we want to re-splice it, you don't want to have to cut the line extra short. You should be able to remove the clamp and pull the splicer directly out of the beer line. You don't have to shove the splicer all the way in, you just got to get in enough so that the little bit more than the width of the clamp. That'll also make it easier to get back out. I'm going to tighten the clamp down, but we're not going to turn the CO2 tank on yet. We're going to go to the other side. We're going to open up the trunk line over there, find the corresponding color. You set the CO2 regulator really low pressure then, and if you're by yourself, you open up the valve and you go to the other side and you make sure that you're getting flow through the line that you've chosen on the other side, just to make sure that somebody hasn't made a splice that you don't know about somewhere and the colors have swapped, or if there's a possible obstruction in the line somewhere else, that it's kinked somewhere and causing you to not get flow through the line. You want to identify that the line at least has flow through it by doing it low pressure. All right, so we're in our media room. This is where the trunk line comes down through the ceiling. So all right, we're in our media room here. This is the other end of the trunk line that comes down from the ceiling. So to isolate the ceiling section that I want to test to see if the leak is indeed above the ceiling or if it's in the remainder of the trunk line before it gets to the dispenser, I picked a spot that I can access to gently cut the trunk line open, and then not going all the way through the foam inside, because you can kind of peel it like this, and you go through the outer jacket again very carefully, trying to make sure not to bury the blade inside the insulation. I pull the insulation away and then I start working around the beer lines inside so that you can't really get them in the way of the blade. And then once you're through the whole thing here, coming around the back to get through just the outer jacket, because the foam is easy to tear. Now that I got it through the jacket, I can kind of rip the rest of the foam, fold the trunk line away, do it up on the top section there, and then it kind of holds the beer line away from the wall so you can work on it. This is if you indeed have easy access to it. If you're coming up from underground instead of coming from overhead, wherever it comes up behind the bar, you're going to be doing this work down there. Now give yourself probably 18 inches or so away from the ground so that you can actually get to it, but you want to be testing as only the underground section, and as close as you can get to where the chase comes up, the better. So I've peeled mine back very gently, scoring the foil to open up the lines inside, and just tear the foil off, get rid of it. And then now we're looking for that light green line, and again, it's on the back side, but since I've exposed this extra bit, you can kind of get some rotation on it. So here is the green line that I'm looking for right back there. Get it kind of peeled out of the trunk line. To help yourself when you're doing this, you can kind of put something behind it to hold on to it so you can get your cutters in there and then get ready to put the cap in. So I've got a razor knife here. Just going to gently slice through the line. I've got the line disconnected now. I'm going to go to the other side and I'm going to turn on real low pressure CO2 to make sure that this line is the same line that I've attached to on the other side. Like I said, you could have two trunk lines spliced together that the beer line colors change on it. From the factory, I've had it before where they've spliced a different beer line on with a different color because they ran out of one. It's only happened once to me, but I always want to confirm that I'm working indeed on the line in question. So it was light green on the other side. I'm going to come back here and after I turn the CO2 on and see if we got flow. All right, so I turned the CO2 on the other side and you can hear that I've got air rushing through it. So I'm going to go turn it off. I'm going to come back. I'm going to put it in the plug, tighten it with a screw clamp, and then show you what next step is. All right, we have identified that this is indeed the line that is going through the ceiling that we had the CO2 on and the one that we want to be testing. So I have a plastic plug here. You just kind of shove it in the end of the beer line. You don't want to go too far in because you can't get them out. You have to cut it, and when you splice it back, you have to extend the line and add an additional splicer, which you try to put as few of those in as you can. So I've got my screw clamp here. I've got it squeezed on just the end of the plug. Now we'll go pressurize the system and identify whether or not the leak is between this location and where we connected the CO2 tank to. All right, so I have come back and the gauges are at 0, so now I know where in the system the leak is. In this video, I'm not going to get into the repair section of it because it gets a little complicated depending on what type of system you have. So you can contact us for specific questions if you are looking to do this yourself or just trying to figure out how to work on one. But the purpose of the video is to show you how to discover in what section the leak is, not exactly to go all the way through an entire repair of one. But I have identified that there is a leak in this section of tubing from where I have my CO2 tank connected to where the plug was inserted. In different situations, this can be repaired. If it's a short section, you can cut open the section of trunk line to identify exactly where your leak is. You then install a splicer to repair that section and then re-insulate everything using the rubber tape, the insulation tape here, and then some foil. So if your trunk line is going underground and you've discovered there's a leak in one of the pieces of tubing that's going underground, it's in a much tougher situation because you can't physically have access to inspect where the leak is. In this situation, the only way to repair that line would be to pull the trunk line out, repair it, and then pull it back in. Now at that point, you can risk damaging the trunk line pulling it out, as well as creating more leaks in that process. You also then have to re-splice on both ends once you've disconnected the system, fixed it, and pulled it back in. If it's going underground, your really best form of action would be to find a different route to be able to install just a couple repair lines for that line, or you would have to pull the trunk line out, and I would recommend replacing the entire thing since you could damage it on the way out. But in this situation, the video is to show you how to use a CO2 tank and a regulator to discover if there is a leak in the section of tubing that you're testing here. And in this case, I opened this up and discovered that there is indeed a leak in the light green line on our system. I'm going to use the process again to figure out what section it's in and then find it so that I can repair it. But this is how you test if there is a leak in a specific section of trunk line. All right, the last thing I wanted to show, even though I'm not going to show you the whole process of finding exactly where the leak is in the trunk line, when you do, you replace the damaged section with the appropriate splicers and clamps, re-insulate there and move forward. So what I'm going to show you though is how to repair where you cut into the trunk line to do your test. On the other side, you disconnect the CO2 line from the CO2 tank. I came to the plug side to show you the same process that you would do on both ends. I'm going to remove the clamp that had the plug in it. Pop the plug out of it now. And then I need to splice this line back together. But what happens a lot is when you cut lines, they'll start to shift. So in this case, they've shifted and they're actually overlapping each other. So I'm going to cut just a little bit of the line that had the fitting in it. Put a 3/8 splicer in here. If you have different length trunk line, then, different diameter trunk line, you would use the appropriate fitting. In this case, we have 3/8 trunk line, so we use 3/8 fittings. We've got an Oetiker clamp. I'm clamping it down nice and tight. And then now you line up with the beer line where the beer line is going to end up laying, and I'm still ever so slightly long on the bottom section. If you leave the beer line too long, it'll bow out of the trunk line, making it harder to insulate and harder to close back up. So I'm going to cut about 3/8 of an inch off there. Do another eyeball, making sure to slide a clamp on. And then if you get it done just right, the pressure of it going back together will slide your bottom beer line onto the splicer for you. In this case, it worked out pretty well. Got to get my clamp lined up. You can use hose clamps, but they have a tendency to loosen over time and be big. So we highly recommend using the appropriate Oetiker clamp and pinchers here. My line's back together. Now I need to refoil, and the reason that foil is used is it acts as a radiator to keep the evenly spread the chilling from the glycol lines to all the beer lines, and it does it through conduction. So I've got myself a little section here. I want to kind of overlap it up under the foam there and down here. Trying to get it to peel back to stay out of my way. Wrap it all the way around. And take another little section of this, lay it on the front. And then once you've wrapped it, you can really squeeze it together to get it to form nice and around the beer lines. Then I'm going to lay the foam back. And you can see here that I've got now a gap between where everything's kind of separated. So you can get this foam here at just pretty much almost any local hardware store. What my job is to completely seal up the seams. So here, where the foam will come together correctly, I'm going to put a piece of tape having it pinched together so there's no air gap. And I'm going to tape that seam back together. And then this will rip by hand if you peel the paper off as you go. I'm going to do the same down here. Now what it's going to leave us though is we're going to be left with this gap here. So what I'll do is I'll take the foam and then I'll just kind of fold it in on itself and make myself something that I can actually stuff in and don't have to fight the adhesive. And what you need to do is you need to get the density of foam back to the level of the original insulation. So you can see here I've done a wrap. I still need quite a bit of insulation in there to make it the same thickness. So again, I'm going to take another chunk here. I'm going to fold it over on itself so it doesn't want to stick too bad. And then I can do this, and then you can even fold it back on itself and you start to fill in, and you'll notice that on the back of this, well, you can't see it, but on the back of it there really isn't a gap because the trunk line is bending in such a way that the foam is touching. So I have a lot less to fill back here. So I'm coming back around the front. I'm going to do one more fold over. I'm going to push this in, bring it back and over, and then you can see that now this density of foam here that was in this gap is the same. And to kind of smooth it out, I take another chunk. Taping around the whole seam on the back side as well. And then now, that section of trunk line is re-insulated to the appropriate thickness. We've got the seams taped. You can bring this jacket back over. It gets kind of wrinkly in its own right, but it just adds kind of a layer of protection there. And then that's when we take the vinyl tape, and then you can keep everything nice and tight together, and then you're filling in the gaps here. You can see I'm fighting our empty keg detector wire. I'm trying not to tape it underneath this, because if I do and I have to get to it, I have to cut through all of this tape. I do have a little section of tape here that's holding it on, so I'm going to release the empty keg detector wire so I have a little bit of easier space to get behind it. I could also take this clamp off to give myself more room to get behind it with the roll of tape here, but a lot of times you don't have these options, so you got to just kind of fight stuff. But now that I've spliced everything together, refoiled it, put the insulation, filled in all the gaps, and then now you tape it up. This is for aesthetics as well as it holds everything together, gives you a little bit of a condensation barrier to keep everything inside the trunk line. So that's the process on how to reconnect where you've cut into a line to do a pressure leak test.